You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up, a cabinet meeting to find solutions to the cost of living crisis becomes a row over net zero policy. We're burning too much coal to slow climate change, a stark warning from a new report. And climate change or corruption? What's to blame for the devastating floods in South Africa? Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hit hardest by those changes and report on the race for solutions. A row has broken out amongst cabinet ministers over how best to deal with the UK's cost of living crisis, with one going so far as to call for an overhaul of net zero targets. Well, let's get more on this. We can speak to Sky's deputy political editor, Sam Coad. So, Sam, what are you hearing?
Britain may have legislated to implement net zero by 2050. It may have hosted the COP climate change summit in Glasgow, but the basics of that target are still being fought over in Cabinet. That happened earlier today. Prime Minister Boris Johnson asked Cabinet ministers to bring ideas to cut people's bills because of the cost of living crisis at this morning's Cabinet, and it quickly descended into a row over net zero. The policing minister, Kit Malthouse, kicked off suggesting that tax cuts were the answer. Jacob Rees-Mogg chipped in that he agreed, but he was the one that once again put those net zero targets on the agenda, at which point Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary whose brief oversees environmental targets, came in and defended them. He's also gone public with his defence of net zero, saying on Twitter, UK gas generation in April 2022 is around 4 times more expensive to run than new solar or wind farms, so mounting a public defence there. Another environmental policy, related policy discussed in Cabinet today, maybe extending the amount of time cars can take before having an MOT from 1 year to 2. Critics suggest that could mean more dirty cars, potentially more dangerous cars on the road as a result. All of this underscores how difficult it is to tackle the cost of living crisis and how easy it is for critics to pick on the net zero target as a potential area for cost savings.
Sam, thank you. Now, too much coal is being burned for the world to stay within safe temperature limits. That's the conclusion of a report by the Global Energy Monitor published today. Coal is the biggest single contributor to global greenhouse emissions, so reducing its use is essential if the world is to have any hope of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. But there is some good news. Our science correspondent, Thomas Moore, is here to explain. Thomas.
Coal is the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels, the one the world needs to abandon most rapidly to avoid catastrophic climate change. So how are we doing? Well, according to a new report by Global Energy Monitor, total coal power capacity under development fell by 13% last year, down from 525 gigawatts to 457, to reach a record low. But that's where the good news ends. The report shows 34 countries still had new coal plants in the pipeline, and the operating capacity of coal plants grew by more than 18 gigawatts as countries delayed plans to retire power stations because of the post-COVID economic rebound and the supply crunch in natural gas. Remember, that was the year of the Glasgow Climate Pact, in which countries agreed to phase out coal. And the urgency was highlighted by the recent IPCC report by UN scientists. To keep the global temperature rise below the critical 1.5 degrees, they said, there can be no new coal plants and coal use needs to fall by 75% by 2030. We are way off that target. Much of the growth in coal was in China, with just over 25 gigawatts of newly commissioned capacity as factories opened up again, nearly offsetting all the coal plant retirements in the rest of the world. And the US also slowed its shutdown of coal plants. In 2019, just over 16 gigawatts of coal power was retired. In 2021, the estimated switch-off was between 6.4 and 9. The trend in Europe was more encouraging, with a record 12.9 gigawatts of capacity retired in 2021. Now, all these figures predate the war in Ukraine. That has turbocharged the price of energy this spring. Not just oil and gas, but coal too spiked as Russia invaded. The EU has said countries could continue to burn coal as an alternative to Russian gas. That's more greenhouse gas emissions, of course. And Global Energy Monitor warns the world needs to do much more, much faster to wean itself off coal.
Thomas, thanks very much indeed. So let's get some of the day's other climate news now. And environmental charities have called for the government to reject plans for the UK's first new coal mine in over 30 years. Communities and Local Government Secretary Michael Gove is considering West Cumbria Mining's application for a new mine near Whitehaven. 14 organisations, including Greenpeace, have written to Mr Gove and urged him to reject the plans, saying hundreds of green jobs in solar power, offshore wind and low-carbon heating could be created instead. The UK government is being urged to provide at least £900 million to help stop a famine in East Africa. Oxfam warns that up to 28 million people are facing severe hunger in parts of Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia following a drought caused by consecutive poor rainfall seasons. The charity says the UK funding is only a third of what it was in 2017, with just £288 million allocated to the countries over the last year. A Brazilian federal court has upheld the suspension of an environmental licence for what was planned to be the largest open-pit gold mine in the Amazon rainforest. Previously, the court ruled that Belo Sun Mining's consultation with local indigenous people didn't meet the criteria required by the National Indian Foundation. Climate campaigners have warned the mine would cause significant deforestation and contaminate nearby rivers, which could threaten local communities. The South African president is sounding the alarm on the climate crisis. More than 400 people died and more are still missing after torrential rain led to flooding and landslides in KwaZulu-Natal province. The city of Durban, the country's largest port and its informal settlements, took the brunt of the flooding after the heaviest rainfall in the region in more than 60 years. Today, in an address to Parliament, President Ramaphosa warned that the effects of climate change are now being felt and the country needs to get serious about climate adaptation.
These storms, honourable members, resulting loss of life and the destruction of key infrastructure are a reminder that climate change remains the biggest single threat to the future of humanity. The South African Weather Service notes that extreme weather events are more prevalent in recent times across most regions of the country. The effects of climate change are already being widely felt. As we rebuild from this disaster, we need to ensure that we are guided by the principles and approaches contained in the adaptation strategy.
Well, joining me now is Dr. Tafadzwa Maphodi, Professor in Climate, Water and Food Systems at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Welcome to you. First of all, do you agree with the President there that extreme weather that's being experienced is down to climate change?
Yes, we have been experiencing an increasing frequency and intensity in weather extremes, both floods and droughts. In the last couple of years. So that's quite accurate.
And what about what this is down to? There's been an extreme loss of life, an extreme number of buildings damaged as well. Is this because those buildings were inadequately built in the first place, do you think, or simply built in the wrong places?
I think the impact of these floods exposes certain things. Mainly the inequality in South Africa that still persists years after the end of apartheid. And the fact that a lot of poor people are still residing within informal settlements that are mostly located in flood risk areas and on steep slopes. So naturally, those people would be at risk if there's a flood, whether they're in a low-lying area, landslides if you're on a steep slope. And because they're settled in informal areas, another thing is naturally, the construction of the houses, it's using cheap materials, there are poor people, there's no proper planning, there's no proper retention for slopes. the design and management of slopes. So it speaks a lot to the issue of poverty and inequality that still persists, which puts people at risk.
Well, yes, and Cyril Ramaphosa is saying climate change is serious. It's here. Given that the country is already suffering from climate change, how much focus is there at the moment on adaptation?
I think there is a focus on adaptation, but it's clearly been underfunded in recent years. The amount of money that has been, channeled specifically towards climate change adaptation is very minimal. And I think it's a dilemma that a lot of developing countries find themselves in, that you're still trying to find economic development. And at the same time, we're having to now adapt to climate change. So that balance between economic development, job creation, alleviating poverty, and then, climate change adaptation, the trade-offs that are in that space, that's one of the challenges that is there. So there's seriously a need to increase the amount of funding going into climate change adaptation, and also to relook at the mega projects, infrastructure projects that are being done to ensure that, those are planned with climate change in mind, they are climate resilient, and also to relook a whole lot of other supporting sectors in the economy that are sensitive to climate change and that are vulnerable to it.
Dr. Tafadzwa Mapoudi, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, I'll be joined by Chief Executive of the Climate Group, Helen Clarkson, and Morgan Gillespie from the Food and Land Use Coalition. And we're going to be discussing some long-term solutions to food insecurity and extreme weather events brought about by climate change.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And let's get straight to some of those climate stories that we've heard about with Helen Clarkson, Chief Executive of the Climate Group, and Morgan Gillespie from the Food and Land Use Coalition. So welcome to both of you. Nice to see you both. So years of drought and poor harvests are threatening serious famine across East Africa. Oxfam has called on the UK government to help with direct funding to alleviate the crisis. But in the face of ever worse drought and with added pressure on food security from the Ukraine war, what are the solutions? So, Morgan, to you first of all. East Africa then suffering drought. So, first of all, what impact is climate change having on food production in Africa?
So food prices are surging around the world. They're in record highs in many countries. Now, this is due not only to climate change, but to conflicts such as the Ukraine crisis, but also COVID, right? The consequences caused by the war in the Ukraine are particularly acute for low-income countries that are reliant on food imports, such as wheat or as fertilizer from Ukraine and Russia. And that includes many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, many of which have already seen an increase in malnutrition rates over recent years. So this is compounding an already quite serious problem.
Well, yes. So, Helen, we've got the problem of climate change really causing challenges for farmers across places like East Africa. But we've also got the war in Ukraine adding complications in there as well because of the problem with the imports of grains, but also fertilizer as well.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing here is, all these problems piling on top of each other. And this is what climate activists have been saying for a long time, in the sense that you've got all these problems in the world, and then you put climate on top of them or underneath them, and it sort of makes them even worse. And that's why we really need to think about resilience in the round and understand that by going after these things individually, that's where we're missing opportunities to build a much more resilient future for everyone.
OK, well, let's try and map out what that resilient future looks like. Morgan, what would your solutions be for local people to try to make sure that they can boost their productivity locally?
Well, I think that there's things that need to happen at multiple levels, right? So governments have a role to play, financial institutions have a role to play, trade organizations, businesses. But there's like 5 or 6 things that can happen pretty urgently that will help mitigate this food crisis. So number 1, we have to maintain open flows of trade. Every nation depends on this for their food supplies. Nations can't start stockpiling food or resources. Number 2, we need to increase food production, but we need to do this mindfully and appropriately in different regions of the world, and we need to do it sustainably and without delay. And that can be in response to the shortages that we're seeing from the war in the Ukraine. Now, what about finance? We need to give the poorest communities around the world safety nets that they need to get through this crisis, and that includes countries in Africa and the Middle East. And we also need to support countries, again, in particular in Africa, with the financing that they need for immediate food supplies, right? These safety nets to address the needs of the poor, for small farmers facing higher input prices. Now, what else can we do kind of outside of in the global north? We can think about things such as relaxing or even eliminating biofuel mandates, at least temporarily. At a time when we're seeing more people facing hunger, the world's cropland should be used to grow food, not fuel. And we really need to avoid efforts made to quickly and unsustainably convert natural land into farmland and instead concentrate production increases on already productive lands. We don't want to start destroying nature, destroying the environment to grow new crops. We want to instead really focus on improving yields on existing productive lands.
Helen, what do you make of those solutions mapped out, and how easy is it to take that broader view when you're in a country that's suffering right now from famine?
I think this is the difficulty, and I think this is where the world's community needs to kind of come together and understand and work together on these long-term solutions. And I think, kind of broadening out even from that, if we look at what's happening with the crisis in Ukraine, you can see lots of countries, and, we heard earlier in your report about, the UK cabinet meeting today and suddenly wanting to jettison these long-term plans. We're not good at long-term planning. We're not good at understanding complex, interconnecting crises. And I think we've got a lot of advice coming out from our sector and others. And what we need is governments to sort of really shift their mindset onto that long term, because the solutions, like the ones that Morgan set out, are there, but they are complex to implement, and they're going to need real cohesion from the global community.
OK, let's move on, because Massive floods in South Africa have left hundreds of people dead and, of course, serious damage. We heard a little bit earlier from President Cyril Ramaphosa. He's not the only person to attribute the devastation to climate change, but also poor infrastructure and lack of investment share the blame as well. So where does the balance lie between mitigation, reducing emissions and adaptation to the effects which are already with us? Morgan, given that you have got a lot of people saying that floods that we're seeing in South Africa are down to climate change, given that climate change is happening now, is there enough focus on adaptation in areas like that?
I actually don't think so. I don't think there's enough focus on adaptation. There's certainly not enough climate finance being pushed towards adaptation. And again, it's not that we don't know the solutions, but we're lacking perhaps the political will, the political might, and certainly the financing to implement those solutions to help these countries that are already being quite clearly impacted in devastating ways.
Well, yes, and Helen, clearly preventing climate change is seen as a huge priority, but is the balance right between the focus on that and the focus on adapting in areas where climate change is already affecting people?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're beyond the point where we've got a choice between adaptation and mitigation, or even that they're two different things now. We've got to adapt to climate change. It's here, it's happening. We're seeing catastrophes like the one now in South Africa. If you look at the figures, I've seen UN figures that show that sort of from 1970 to 2000, the world experienced sort of 90 to 100 medium to large disasters a year. In 2015, that number had gone up to 400, and by 2030, we're expecting it over 550. That's a huge difference in what the world needs to be dealing with. So the idea that we can, not adapt or understand that impact isn't there. But mitigation is an important contributor to adaptation, because if we want fewer catastrophes to happen, we need to limit the carbon going into the atmosphere now and try and pull back as close as we can to that 1.5 degree target. So we need to be doing everything. And I think people think, we can choose this or choose that. But actually, we've really got to put climate at the heart of all our decisions now, whether those are infrastructure decisions on, the way that you build infrastructure and the materials you use, and how do you move towards zero carbon infrastructure, the accelerating the energy transition as rapidly as possible. All of these things kind of come together to make a more resilient world where we limit warming as far as we can, and then set ourselves up for surviving that world that we've created.
And Morgan, when you come to the adaptation part of that, it costs money, doesn't it? Building flood defences costs money, doesn't it? And the poorer nations would say, we contributed the least to climate change, we tend to be suffering the most, and the polluters ought to pay for it. So is that happening? Is enough money getting through to the people that need it?
No, absolutely not. There's not enough money in the system. There's not enough money being pushed towards these countries. We saw that as an outcome of COP26. The big gaps are still around financing. And that's not to say that other things can't be done. There are solutions out there that can be implemented now. One of those things that sort of links to what Helen was talking to is thinking about nature-based solutions, particularly within food and land use systems. And they're simple to say, but they are hard to implement. But, we can do things like just stop deforestation. We could halt deforestation today, and that would make a significant difference in mitigating emissions and developing greater sinks to increase our carbon storage capabilities. Linked to that, we can also adopt more productive and regenerative land use practices, right? So adapting to climate change by leveraging new farming techniques that enable us to produce more crops on less land and more regenerative ways, so that we're protecting biodiversity, protecting freshwater resources. And some of these new techniques don't cost lots of money, right? You can kind of support farmers in less expensive ways to start implementing these now. And as Helen said, we kind of have to throw all of the tools that we have in the toolkit towards this problem. We really don't have much time to lose.
OK, and Helen, we don't have much time actually left on the programme either. So very briefly, is the biggest problem money when it comes to adaptation, or are governments just too short term?
I think it's both. And I think, we've seen the right commitments. We're way forward on where we were Paris 5 years ago on what governments are willing to say, but now they need the will to act right away. And I think we're seeing a bit too much, look at our net zero target, but we'll just do this one last bad thing. And we just don't have time now for one last coal mine or one last fossil fuel investment. We need to take those targets that governments have set and make them a reality. And that needs money and it needs will.
Lots of ideas and solutions. Helen and Morgan, very interesting to talk to you both. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So coming up, after the row about newspaper comments about Angela Rayner, Trevor Phillips and guests will discuss whether misogyny should be made a hate crime. That's on Common Ground, which is up next. But that's it from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.